Hey, this lesson we are going to be looking at loops and conditions, and we are going to be using loops and conditions a whole lot in the upcoming lessons, so it is important to understand the fundamentals. So this lesson is going to provide a quick review and an overview of how they work. So one of the things with the loops is it allows us to run a piece of code over multiple times. So let's set up a quick loop here. So we're doing a for loop. There's also while loops as well. So those are the two main different types of loops. And we're also going to be showing you how you can loop through the items within an array using for each. So let's loop through, and how many times do we want to loop? So we want to loop it 10 times, increment I by 1. So all of the loops are going to require certain parameters. So there's a starting point for the loop, there's a condition that the loop has to meet to continue looping, and then there's a way to change the value so that eventually we have a way out of our loop. So we don't want to create a loop that endlessly runs and doesn't have an end to it. So that's one of the things to keep in mind when you are creating loops. And I'll just create a string value here, counter, and this is going to output and track whatever the value of I is. So it allows us to iterate through and run through a block of code a number of times. And let's run through. And so that allows us to output into the log 10 times really easily with just those few lines of code. There's also the while loop. So let's let x equals 0, and we're going to do while x is less than, or x is less than 10. So the format is the same. So we've got our condition out of the loop, we've got our starting value, and then we've got our value of incrementing value of x. And then also within this block of code, we might have some other values that we want to run. So x were incremented by 1. And let's run it one more time. So now we should have two iterations. So once the first loop finishes, the second loop starts and outputs all of the values accordingly to what our code is. So also for arrays, there's a quick and easy way to loop through arrays. So we saw in the last lesson that arrays will have a length value. So let me output the array and get its length. And I'll comment out these blocks so that we have only just the relevant content within the log. So logging out, and we see that this particular array has 3 items, and we know that it's 0 based, so 0, 1, 2. So let's use a for loop to output the value, so setting the value of y to 0. So that's going to reference our first item in the index, and we're going to loop through while I is less than the length of the array, and then increment I by 1. And then within the log, we're going to output whatever the value is of the item according to the index value. We'll use y as our index value for the array items. So we'll output it this way, and then this will log out each one of the values that we have in our array. So let's see how that looks. So that's one way that we can loop through an array. And actually a more effective way to loop through the array is to use the for each method. So that allows us to loop through the value, and we can assign a value to the property for each individual item within the array. So this can be an element value, and we're going to use the short format for function. So it's the equal sign and the arrow format. So this is the newer format for functions, and you're allowed to use that within the Google Apps script. So what we're going to be doing as we iterate through the contents of the array, we're going to be outputting the element. And you can also track other values such as the index value. And then let's also use that index value in the output of the console. So that way we can get the index as well as the value that's contained within it. And we see we've got the value and its index value and so on. So it's one of the ways as well that we're going to be using JavaScript, different JavaScript functions that are commonly used functions in JavaScript in order to interact with our content. Also, when it comes to arrays, if we have multiple objects and we want to loop through the contents of an array, so let's set up an empty array, and I'll just call this my array, and we're just going to declare an empty array, and then we're going to use the for loop, and we'll populate it with 10 items into it. And then for the for loop, we're going to take the my array and we'll push content into the array. So what type of content do we want to put in? Let's add in some values there. And then we'll use the value of Q, so the $sign and the curly brackets. We're using the template literal. So we'll push these values into the array. And actually, we're going to do this within an object format. So first we'll do it this way, and then next we'll do it within an object format. So after we loop through within the logger log, let's output the contents of this current array. So we've got all of those items being deposited in there. So let's update this to be an object. So it's referencing an object, and we'll create the object here on the fly. So if this is the first name of the person, and this person's and we use the value of Q, so we have different values, and then the last name, and then we'll push the object into the array. So this is the array content that we have. Notice the structure, that each item within the array, it's an object, and the structure is the same. So that makes it really easy for us to retrieve the information that's contained within the array. So let's take the newly constructed array, use for each, and I'll assign a value of person. And then within the logger log, if we want to retrieve back the person as we iterate through the array, we can retrieve back the person using person first and then person last. So you can use the dot notation, you can use the bracket notation. So let's output the contents, and that gave us all of the names, and we were able to construct the full names from the contents within the array. And one last thing before we conclude. So with arrays and objects, they reference a particular memory location. So now that we've constructed the array, let's create a new array. And we're going to create the new array from the contents of the old array. So we'll assign the value of new array to the old array. And now what happens if I take the new array and I update item index value number 2 and equals new item, and then within the log we log out the contents of the original my array. So what do you think is going to happen is this over here, remember we're assigning a value to the new item within the array. So it's actually flagging it because we're reassigning a value. So we could change this to let. So this is just an error that's saying typically because we've got the new array that we're reassigning a value, but we're using the index value. So we're assigning the item with the index value of 2 to a new value. So outputting the value of my array, what do you think we're going to have there? Because we've updated the new array, do you think the my array is going to get updated? Let's run it and find out. So when we go to the my array, and remember this is the original array that we were working with, we do see that it's been updated with the new item. And that's because this new array is referencing the same memory location as the my array. So it doesn't matter which values we change, it's going to reflect within both of them. So if we were to take the my array and select item number 5 and update that value with my array here, and then we log out the contents of the new array, so do you think that that value is going to be reflected within that? And I'm going to comment out some of this log messages. Now let's run the code and see what we've got for our output. And we see that both of the arrays, even though that we updated one and then we updated the other, they're both going to be the same because they're referencing the same memory location. And that's the unique thing, and that's also why we can use const for arrays and objects in order to, and then we can update the values and it's going to be reflected within the same one.